disowned and left entirely homeless. In the space of a single afternoon, a grieving 20-year-old was ruthlessly mocked by her greedy brothers for inheriting nothing but a dry, worthless well on a patch of dead earth. The arrogant men had greedily seized the entire family estate, absolutely certain they had successfully condemned their sister to a life of humiliating poverty. They had no idea the desolate dirt they tossed aside secretly harbored a staggering hidden fortune. And they never suspected this discarded ruin concealed the exact power she needed to build a thriving legacy, obliterate their cruel expectations, and claim an empire they could never touch. Stay close. Settle in for this story, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Helen Ward was the youngest child and only daughter of Arthur Ward, a man more comfortable with schematics and stone than he was with social niceties, or it seemed his own sons. Arthur had been a captain of sappers in the Royal Engineers before inheriting the modest Staffordshire estate of Oakshade, and he carried the quiet, methodical precision of his former life into his new one. He managed his lands not with the bluster of a country squire, but with the careful attention of a man checking fortifications for weaknesses. His 3 sons, Thomas, Edward, and George, were cut from a different cloth entirely. They saw the estate as a measure of status, the timber as boarded feet to be sold, the tenant farms as lines on a ledger. They saw land, but their father saw the ground beneath it. Helen, however, had been his shadow while her brothers were learning to shoot and ride. She was trailing after him, her small hands tracing the mortar lines of the garden walls, her questions not about yields or rents, but about foundations and drainage. He spoke to her of stress and load, of the patient way water could defeat stone, and of the simple, honest strength of a well-laid course of brick. Her mother had died when she was 6, a quiet fading that left a house full of men who did not know what to do with a girl. And so she found her place not in the drawing room, but in the outbuildings and along the property lines, where the real work of the world was done. Her true education came from Mr. Abel Finch, the estate's groundskeeper and stonemason, a man whose hands were gnarled into the shape of the tools he used. He was 70 years old, with eyes the color of a winter sky, and he spoke in sentences as short and solid as the stones he set. He saw in Helen a curiosity that her brothers lacked. He taught her how to mix mortar until it was the perfect consistency, not too wet to slump, not too dry to crumble. He taught her how to read a stone, to see its grain and its bedding plain, to know where to strike it so it would cleave clean. He showed her the difference between a header and a stretcher, the purpose of a king post, the quiet integrity of a Roman arch. He gave her a small stonemason's hammer for her 12th birthday, its head forged by the village blacksmith, its hickory handle worn smooth and shaped for a smaller grip. It was her most treasured possession. Her father approved of these lessons, watching from a distance with a rare, quiet smile. "A wall is an honest thing, Helen," he told her once, his hand resting on a gate-post Abel had set. "It tells you its secrets if you know how to listen." In his final years, as his health began to fail, he would often walk with her to the forgotten edge of the property, to the old dry well on the scrubland. He would stand and look down into it, saying very little. "The best thing I own. This is," he murmured one day, tapping the stone, coping with his walking stick. "Remember that. It is the best and most reliable thing on all this land." She did not understand then, and when he died, the words felt like just another of her father's strange, solitary pronouncements. The ejection was a quiet, bloodless affair, conducted in the stale air of the solicitor's office in Stafford. The room smelled of sealing wax and dust, and the windows looked out onto a street grey with drizzle. Helen sat on a hard-backed chair, her hands folded in the lap of her plain black mourning dress. Her brothers, Thomas, Edward, and George, sat opposite, their own black coats already seeming too tight, as if they were swelling with the importance of the occasion. Mr. Davies, the solicitor, a man with a face like worn parchment, read from the last will and testament of Arthur Ward in a dry monotone. The main house, Oakshade Manor, with all its furnishings and effects, went to Thomas, the eldest. The South Farms, with their tenant revenues, went to Edward. The Northwoods and the timber rights went to George. Each bequest was met with a solemn, self-satisfied nod from the recipient. Helen waited. Her father had always been fair, if not warm. Surely there was something. Finally, Mr. Davies cleared his throat. "And to my daughter, Helen Grace Ward," he read, "I bequeath the parcel of land known as the Well Plot, comprising 1/4 acre, situated at the eastern boundary of the estate, adjacent to the Canwick Parish Road, along with the dry well situated thereon." A small, almost imperceptible smirk touched Thomas's lips. The well plot was a joke, a patch of stony ground, good for nothing but rabbits and gorse, its well having been dry for 50 years. "It was worthless," the solicitor continued. "Furthermore, a sum of 10 sterling is to be provided to my daughter for her immediate needs." He slid a small cloth bag of coins across the polished mahogany table. It made a dull, insufficient sound. 10 pounds. It was an insult, a pittance to be rid of her. There was no argument, no outburst. Helen's grief for her father was a cold, hard stone inside her, and this final public dismissal by her brothers simply settled another layer of dust upon it. She looked at their faces, Thomas's smug authority, Edward's grasping pleasure, George's simple boyne satisfaction. They were strangers to her, men who had shared her father's name, but never his substance. She stood, her movements calm and deliberate. "I will require the deed to the property," she said, her voice even. Mr. Davies, surprised by her composure, shuffled through his papers and produced the document. She took it, folded it neatly, and placed it in her satchel next to the familiar weight of her little hammer. She picked up the bag of coins. She did not look at her brothers again. She walked out of the office, leaving the 3 new masters of Oakshade to their inheritance of land and timber. She had a deed, 10 pounds, and the memory of her father's words about a useless well. It was, she knew, all she would ever get from them, and she would have to make it enough. The cold finality of the solicitor's door, clicking shut behind her, was not an ending, but the harsh, grating sound of a new beginning. The journey was not long in miles, but measured a lifetime in loss. From the grand stone gate posts of Oakshade Manor to the edge of Canwick village was less than 2 mami, a distance she had walked 100 times. But this time she was not walking out for a ramble. She was walking away for good. She had arranged for a carter to take her 1 small trunk to the village inn, and now she followed on foot, wanting the slowness, the finality of each step. The Staffordshire sky was a familiar blanket of low, bruised clouds, and a damp chill rose from the earth. The lane was muddy, and the hedge on either side were bare and tangled, their black branches stark against the grey light. She walked past fields that had belonged to her father, fields her brother Edward now owned, where winter wheat lay dormant under the damp soil. She saw the copse of ash and oak that was now George's, its timber waiting for the axe. She passed a tenant cottage where a woman she had known her whole life, Mrs. Albright, was hanging out, washing in the damp air. The woman saw her, hesitated, and then gave a small, uncertain nod, a gesture of sympathy mixed with the fear of showing loyalty to the dispossessed. Helen nodded back, a tightness in her throat. Every landmark was a memory, now sealed in the past. The familiar world had become a foreign country. She clutched the strap of her satchel, the weight of the hammer inside a small, solid comfort. As she drew nearer to Canwick, the land grew rougher, the soil thinner and more stubborn. This was the eastern edge of the estate, the part her father had never bothered to cultivate. And then she saw it. A low, crumbling stone wall marked the boundary of her inheritance. Beyond it lay a quarter-acre of neglect. Garse bushes, thick and spiny, clung to the slight rise of the ground, and last year's thistles stood like skeletal sentinels. In the center of it all was the well. It was just as she remembered it, a circle of dark moss-speckled stone rising about 3 feet from the ground, capped with a weathered grey oak winding assembly, whose rope had long since rotted away. This was hers, this patch of weeds and stone and a deep, dark hole. She pushed open the rickety gate, which groaned on its one good hinge, and stepped onto her own land. The air felt different here, stiller, lonelier. She walked to the well and leaned over the coping, peering into the blackness. A cool, earthy smell, like a freshly opened root cellar, rose to meet her. It did not smell of stagnant water, only of damp stone and deep earth. For a long moment, she just stood there, the chill of the stone seeping into her palms, the silence broken only by the rustle of the wind in the dry weeds. This was not a home. It was not a farm. It was a problem, a puzzle, an ending. But as she looked down into that silent, patient darkness, her father's words echoed in her mind, "The best thing I own." She did not feel despair. Instead, a flicker of something else took hold, the quiet, stubborn curiosity of a builder looking at a ruin, wondering not what it was, but what it could be. Her first act as a landowner was one of pure practical assessment. She walked the perimeter of the small plot, her boots sinking into the damp soil, pushing through the scratching branches of gorse. The boundary was marked by a dry stone wall, tumbled down in several places, but fundamentally sound. Abel Finch had taught her that a good wall has its own grammar, and she could see the logic in its construction, the careful placement of tie stones locking the two faces together. It was salvageable. The land itself was poor, the soil thin and studded with stones. But on the southern-facing slope, sheltered by a thicket of hawthorn, was a patch where the grass grew a little greener, the earth a little darker, a garden, perhaps, if it could be watered. But everything depended on the well. She returned to it, running her hands over the coping stones. They were grit stone, locally quarried, and expertly dressed. The tooling marks were still visible beneath the patina of moss and lichen. This was no farmer's field, well. It was built with skill and intention. The winding gear, a simple drum and axle of oak, was weathered but not rotten. The iron fittings were rusted but intact. The structure was sound. She lay on her stomach, her head and shoulders over the edge, and peered down the shaft. It was a perfect circle about 4 feet in diameter, descending into absolute blackness. She dropped a small stone and counted. 1, 2, 3. A faint thump echoed up from the bottom. It was deep, and it was unquestionably dry. For the rest of the day, she worked. She went into Canwick and used a few of her precious shillings to buy a length of sturdy rope and a pulley from the ironmonger and a bucket and a lantern from the general store. The shopkeepers watched her with pitying curiosity. They all knew the story of Arthur Ward's strange daughter and her worthless inheritance. She ignored their whispers, her focus entirely on the task ahead. Back at the plot, she rigged the pulley to the oak crossbeam of the winding gear, threaded the rope, and tied one end securely around her waist, looping the other several times around the drum for friction. It was a makeshift but effective system. She lit the lantern and lowered it into the shaft, watching the small circle of light descend, illuminating the stone lining. The walls were slick with dampness, but not streaming with water. Clear's throat. The construction was impeccable, each course of stone laid with a precision that spoke of military engineering. Her father's hand was in this. She felt it. The lantern reached the bottom, revealing a floor of rubble and dirt. With a deep breath, she began her own descent. Bracing her feet against the curved walls, she walked herself down, hand over hand, the rope biting into her palms. The air grew colder, smelling of stone and deep time. She was not afraid. She was a mason's apprentice, inspecting a piece of work. This was familiar territory, a place of logic and structure, more comprehensible to her than the solicitor's office had been. She was home. She had descended about 30 feet, a little more than halfway, when her searching hands found it. One section of the wall felt different. The mortar joints were thinner, the texture finer than the coarse lime mortar used elsewhere. The stones themselves, a set of 3 dressed blocks forming a neat rectangle, were not quite flush with the surrounding courses. They were set back by less than 1/4 of an inch, a detail no one would ever notice unless they were feeling for it. She paused, her feet braced, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She pulled the small hammer from her satchel. Its familiar weight was a comfort in the darkness. She remembered Abel's lesson. Listen to the stone. A solid wall sounds dead. A hollow place sings. She tapped the center stone gently. Thud. She tapped the one next to it. Thud. She tapped the stone in the middle of the strange section. It made a distinctly different sound, a hollow, resonant thunk, a song. Taking the chisel end of her hammer, she began to carefully work at the fine mortar joint. It was hard but brittle, chipping away in small pieces. It was cement, not lime mortar, a material her father had often praised for its strength and water resistance. After 10 minutes of patient work, she had cleared enough of the joint to pry the tip of her hammer into the gap. She levered it gently. The stone didn't move. She put more weight on it, and with a low groan of protest, the block shifted inward. It was not a stone. It was a plug. Behind it was a dark cavity. Her hands trembling slightly. She reached inside and felt the cold, smooth surface of a metal box. It was heavy. With some effort, she managed to draw it out. It was a tin deed box about a foot long and 8 in wide, sealed with a thick layer of wax around its lid. She secured it in a canvas bag tied to her belt, replaced the stone plug as best she could, and began the slow, arduous climb back to the surface. Pulling herself over the coping stone, she collapsed onto the grass, breathing heavily. The tin box, a cold, hard weight against her. She sat there for a long time, the grey sky above, the silent earth below, and held the secret of the well in her hands. With the edge of her hammer, she broke the wax seal and pried open the lid of the tin box. The contents were packed tightly, cushioned with oilcloth. On top lay a sealed envelope, her name Helen, written on it in her father's neat architectural script. Beneath it, she felt the unmistakable, heavy, reassuring heft of stacked coins in canvas bags. She lifted one out. It was heavy, far heavier than the 10 tlawls from the solicitor. She loosened the drawstring and poured a cascade of gold into her palm. Sovereigns, bright and clean, each one stamped with the Queen's profile. She counted the coins in the first bag. 50. She opened the others. There were 5 bags in total. 250 gold sovereigns, a fortune. It was more money than she had ever imagined seeing in one place. For a moment, she felt dizzy. The reality of it too vast to comprehend. This was not just survival. This was a foundation. This was the means to build a life. Finally, her hands shaking slightly, she picked up the letter. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The letter was dated 6 months before her father's death. "My dearest Helen," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and your brothers have proven to be the men I always knew they were. I am sorry for the manner of this inheritance, but it was the only way I could ensure it reached you, and only you. Your brothers see land as power, but you, like me, see it as potential. They would have squandered this on frivolities. You will build something with it. In my time as a sapper, I learned that the safest place to hide something of value is not in a locked room or a buried chest, but in a place of such obvious worthlessness that no one ever thinks to look twice. Everyone in the county knows this well is dry. No one would ever think to go down it. The money here, 250 sovereigns, is the result of my own savings over many years, separate from the estate. It is yours, free and clear. Use it to make a place for yourself. Buy the cottage adjacent if old man Hemlock will sell. Sink a new bore if you must, but I do not think you will have to. The well is not dry. Its feeder spring is merely blocked. I collapsed the lower seam myself 30 years ago. The plans for the original bore are with this letter. You will know what to do. The well was my first project when I left the army. A way to keep my hands busy. It is built to last, just as you are. Be well, my girl. Your loving father, Arthur Ward. Tucked into the fold of the letter was a small rolled schematic, a cross-section of the well showing its depth, its stone lining, and a secondary channel marked feeder spring with a note indicating a deliberate blockage of clay and stone at the 50-foot level. At the bottom of the box, beneath the bags of coin, lay one last object, a small, perfectly preserved ammonite fossil. its spiral polished smooth by the touch of 1,000 hands. It was the one her father had kept on his desk his entire life. The first interesting thing he had ever found as a boy. He had left her his first treasure and his last. She sat by the well as the light began to fade, the letter clutched in her hand, the gold heavy in her lap, and she wept, not for her homelessness or her brother's cruelty, but for the quiet, meticulous, and boundless love of the father. She had only truly understood now in his absence. The first part of the rebuilding was a quiet transaction. Helen, dressed in her best remaining gown, went to see Mr. Hemlock, the elderly farmer who owned the dilapidated cottage and the acre of land that bordered her well plot. The cottage had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, its thatch roof sagging. Mr. Hemlock, a man whose face was a map of cynical disappointments, was surprised to see her. He was even more surprised when she made him an offer. She laid 20 gold sovereigns on his kitchen table. His eyes, accustomed to seeing the world in terms of shillings and pence, widened. He had thought the cottage and its sour acre were worthless. He tried to bargain out of sheer habit, but Helen held firm. 20 sovereigns was more than fair, and they both knew it. By the end of the hour, she had a signed bill of sale, and by the end of the week, the deed was transferred. She now owned a home, or at least the bones of one, and enough land for a proper garden and a small paddock. The second part of the rebuilding was far more difficult. It required not just money, but knowledge that went beyond her own. She needed to clear the well. She sought out Silas Croft, a man in his late 60s who lived on the far side of Canwick. He was the last of the old well diggers in the area, a trade that was slowly being replaced by steam-powered drills. He was a wiry, silent man with clay ingrained in the lines of his hands. Helen found him splitting firewood behind his cottage. She explained what she needed to clear the bottom of a 60-foot well. He looked at her, his gaze skeptical. "That's Ward's old dry well," he said, his voice raspy. "There's no water in it. Never has been." "My father believed its spring was blocked," she replied calmly, showing him the schematic. "I need someone with the skill to clear it safely." Silas studied the drawing, his brow furrowed. He recognized the careful draftsmanship. He looked from the paper to the young woman standing before him, poised, serious, and clearly not one to be trifled with. He was intrigued despite himself. "It's dangerous work," he said. "It'll cost you, and I'll need my son David to help. I will pay you fairly for your time and your expertise," Helen said. He named a price that was high, expecting her to bargain. She simply nodded. "When can you start?" The next morning, Silas and David Croft arrived at the well plot with a cart full of equipment, heavy timbers for a proper winch, thick ropes, specialized buckets, and miners' lanterns. David, a strong young man of Helen's age, was as skeptical as his father had been, but he held his tongue. For the next week, the three of them worked. Silas, with his lifetime of experience, directed the operation from the surface, managing the winch and the ropes with practiced economy. Helen and David took turns being lowered to the bottom. Down in the cold, dark shaft, they filled bucket after bucket with the dirt, rubble, and compacted clay that her father had used to block the spring. It was back-breaking, claustrophobic work. They communicated with a series of tugs on a signal rope. 1 tug, haul up. 2 tugs, stop. 3 tugs, emergency. David, who had initially been dismissive of her, soon came to respect her stamina and her surprising knowledge of stonework. She was not afraid of the dark, the dirt, or the hard labor. She worked as his equal. On the 5th day, as Helen was digging at the last of the clay plug, she felt a change in the texture of the earth. It grew soft, then muddy. A moment later, with a low gurgle, a trickle of cold, clear water began to seep from the rock seam. "Water!" she called up, her voice echoing in the shaft. "We found water." By evening, there was a foot of it at the bottom. By the next morning, there were 6 feet. The well was no longer dry. With the well restored and the cottage secured, Helen's life began to take on a new shape, one defined not by what she had lost, but by what she was building. The water from the well was cold, clear, and abundant, and news of it spread through Canwick. The village pump often ran low during the dry summer months, its water brackish and tasting of iron. But Helen's well, fed by a deep, reliable spring, never faltered. It became a resource, and through it, she became part of the community. It began with small exchanges. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, whose bread was the pride of the village, found her own well struggling. She approached Helen hesitant one afternoon, offering a trade, a large loaf of her finest bread every day, in exchange for 2 buckets of water for her dough. Helen agreed immediately. Soon others followed. Mr. Price, the blacksmith, whose forge consumed a great deal of water for quenching hot metal, offered to repair and strengthen the well's old iron winding mechanism. He spent a full day at his forge, crafting new brackets and a new handle. And when he was finished, he refused any payment beyond a handshake and the right to draw water when he needed it. The well became a quiet hub of village life. People didn't just come for water. They stopped to talk, to pass on news, to watch Helen as she worked on her cottage and her garden. She hired Silas and David Croft again, this time to help her with the cottage. With their help and the knowledge she had from Mr. Finch, she learned to re-atch the roof with local reed, to mix lime plaster for the interior walls, and to reglaze the old leaded windows. She worked alongside them every day, her hands becoming calloused, her face browned by the sun. People in the village grew accustomed to the sight of her hair tied back, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, hammering a lath or carrying a hod of mortar. They stopped seeing her as the squire's disinherited daughter, and started seeing her as Helen Ward of Springwell Cottage, a name that seemed to rise up from the community itself. She planted her garden on the south-facing slope, turning over the stony soil and enriching it with manure from a neighboring farm, paid for with a few shillings. She planted potatoes, cabbages, beans, and herbs. The constant supply of water from the well meant her garden thrived, while others struggled in the dry spells. She was no longer just surviving. She was producing. She had an abundance. She had a home. People knew her name. And when she walked into the village, they greeted her not with pity, but with a nod of plain earned respect. She had become a fixture of the place, as solid and dependable as the stone walls of her well. One cool evening in late autumn, a year after she had been cast out, Helen stood by the well. The day's work was done. The cottage behind her was warm and bright, a thread of smoke rising from its newly repaired chimney into the twilight sky. The garden was put to bed for the winter, its beds neatly mulched. The new winding mechanism on the well was silent and strong, its oak handle smooth and dark with linseed oil. A bucket of clear, cold water sat on the coping stone. A perfect circle of evening sky reflected in its surface. In one hand, she held the small, balanced stonemason's hammer that Abel Finch had given her, its handle now worn to the shape of her own grip. In the other, she held the polished ammonite fossil her father had left her, its ancient spiral cool against her palm. She thought of the two men, her father and the old stonemason, who had taught her to see the world not for what it appeared to be, but for its underlying structure, its hidden strengths, its secret songs. They had given her the vision to see a foundation where others saw only a ruin. Her brothers, she had heard, were already quarreling over timber rights and property lines, their inheritance already a source of discord. They had seen a dry well and a useless patch of scrub and dismissed it. Her father had seen a fortress, a legacy built of stone and water and love, and he had hidden the key in plain sight, knowing that only she would have the skill, the patience, and the heart to find it. Helen Ward had been 20 years old and homeless. She had 10 to her name, and she was given a dry well. It was the greatest inheritance she could have ever received. What we throw away, what we overlook, often holds the very thing we need most. It is the forgotten attic, the overgrown garden. Clear's throat. The story of an elder. We never took the time to listen to. The world is full of dry wells waiting for someone to look closer. What is the dry well in your own life that might hold a hidden spring? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story of quiet strength and hidden value resonated with you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others who might find a piece of themselves within it. Thank you for being here with